Good afternoon. Oops, pretty loud. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming into the auditorium on such a bright, sunny day, but this will be a pretty happy topic that we'll be exploring today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Nigro, who I've known for almost 30 years through the Art Institute of Chicago, where Jeff has worked in various capacities for over 3 decades. Through most of those years, he served in the department formerly known as the Department of Museum Education as a lecturer and as director of adult programs. Currently at the Art Institute, Jeff is a research associate in the Department of Arts of the Ancient Mediterranean in Byzantium, and he's also an adjunct lecturer in what is now called the Department of Interpretation. He also teaches adult education seminars at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and he's a frequent speaker for the Jane Austen Society of North America and is the former regional coordinator of the Greater Chicago chapter of the Jane Austen Society. As a veteran lecturer at the Art Institute with its encyclopedic collection, Jeff has lectured and spoken on everything from ancient Chinese tomb sculpture to postmodern painting. Today, he'll be speaking on a synthesis of 2 of his favorite topics, the history of fashion and the age of Jane Austen. His title, as you see on the screen, is Regency Fashion from Jane Austen to Bridgerton. Won't you join me in welcoming Jeff to the stage?
Thank you very much, David. I hope everybody can hear me. All right, okay, thank you. Thank you, David, for the lovely introduction, and thanks to David for inviting me to come to speak to you. And thank you all for coming, as David said, when it's a beautiful sunny day out. You want to take advantage of it, so I appreciate your coming indoors to hear this talk, which, as David said, is Regency Fashion from Jane Austen to Bridgerton. I should say, full disclosure, Jane Austen, I have taught every one of her novels. I've worked very closely with the Jane Austen Society of North America. I'm also here with my friend William Phillips from Chicago, who is, like me, a life member of Jane Austen Society. So if you have any questions about Jane Austen Society of North America or JASNA, let us know. But on the other hand, Bridgerton, I'm a little less of an expert in. Full disclosure, I only made it through a couple of episodes of the first season, and I had some issues. And so I didn't get very far, but I hope I can say something interesting about the costumes. This is not going to be a history of Regency fashion, nor do I have the time to explore every facet of Regency fashion. What I want to do today is to talk about certain examples that I can use that lead to, I think, larger topics having to do with questions of, for example, historical accuracy, insofar as that's possible or desirable in costuming in Regency period dramas like Bridgerton, to talk about some of the myths surrounding Regency fashion, and also this kind of ideals versus realities of Regency dress and how it is often, again, portrayed in the visual arts, the visual culture that we have that survives from the era, but also the way period dramas stage it and the way they use costuming. And then also to talk a little bit about this kind of nostalgia for the Regency as reflected in Regency dress. So let's begin by, and I realize that for a lot of you, this will be kind of review, but just to point out something which, again, it has a lot to do with questions of historical accuracy and what we mean by Regency dress. So here is a portrait of the Prince Regent by Sir Thomas Lawrence, whose title as Prince Regent gives that name to the era, to the Regency era. He is the eldest child and the heir of King George III, who was in fact King of Great Britain, later the United Kingdom, through the entirety of Jane Austen's lifetime, from 1775 to 1817, or Jane Austen's dates. But he was the regent was Prince of Wales, of course, the traditional title given to the heir to the British throne. But he was Prince Regent technically only from 1811 to 1820, when the final mental incapacity of his father George III made a regency appear to be necessary. And then he became King George IV in 1820. The regent was a great fan of Jane Austen's novels. The feeling was not mutual. She did not have much respect for him, but he was technically only regent from 1811 to 1820. So the actual regency just encompasses that slightly less than a decade period. But for a variety of social and cultural reasons, historians and art historians and others use the term the Regency era or the Regency period to apply to a much larger period of time from about the mid-1790s until the death of George IV, the former Prince Regent, in 1830, or even some people would push it up to 1837, when the accession of Queen Victoria to the British throne clearly inaugurates a kind of new era. And I bring this up because although the Regency period, it can be defined very broadly, when you look at period dramas like Bridgerton, they tend to focus on that 1811 to 1820 period. And that's, I think, for reasons of costuming, in addition to a lot of other reasons, which I won't be able to explore. But this encompasses not only Jane Austen period dramas, but also something like Bridgerton, which is derived from a series of novels, romance novels by Julia Quinn. There is a whole subsection, a whole kind of subcategory of romance novels, which are specifically set in the Regency period. And again, I think the Regency period has a lot of appeal for a lot of people. And part of the appeal is the costuming for reasons that I'll mention in just a moment. To get to Jane Austen, this is actually that Thomas Lawrence portrait is enormous. This is a tiny little painting, a watercolor, a portrait of Jane Austen by her sister Cassandra, who is a very talented amateur artist. There are only two completely verifiable images of Jane Austen taken in her lifetime, both of them done by her sister. I show this one where you can't even see her face, which is a little frustrating, but you can certainly see her outfit. The bonnet that she's wearing, this kind of poke bonnet. There were many, many different kinds of headdresses and hats and different styles that were available and during the Regency period. But it's this bonnet, but also this pelisse that she's wearing, as it's called, which is a kind of overcoat, high-waisted in that Regency manner, with the puffed sleeves, and you see the white underskirt over which she is wearing this. Similarly to this idea of when do you consider the Regency period to be, Jane Austen, born 1775, died in 1817. Her novels, Jane Austen wrote from the time she was a teenager, but she only began to publish her first novel in the first year of the Regency, 1811, when Sense and Sensibility was published, and then the other novels followed suit, as you can see on this list here. Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, or rather the novels that became the novels of that title, really began in the mid-1790s. Austen was writing them at that time, but she revised them and finally published them during the 18-teens, during the Regency era proper. And one of the other novels that she began in the late 1790s, Northanger Abbey, as we know it, was not published until after her death, at the same time that her final completed novel, Persuasion, was published. So you see once again that Austen's lifetime encompasses more than the strict Regency decade, but the novels themselves were published during that same time. So it's all of this encouragement to think of this 1811 to 1820 period, specifically focusing on the teens and on the costuming of that era. Austen herself lived during a period where the changes in fashion from the time of her birth to the time of her death could not have been more dramatic. When Austen was born in 1775, Well-to-do people and even not so well-to-do people were dressing something like this. This is a family group by Francis Wheatley that dates from the late 1770s. You can see that it's still acceptable for men to wear light colors, dove gray and pink, colors that did not yet acquire at that time specifically feminine associations. Men are wearing lace cuffs, lace cravats, knee breeches with stockings and sort of pumps, and of course the little powdered wig, which is a fashion that was true for men throughout the 18th century and was simply part of good grooming for a well-dressed man. The woman seated on the left is wearing a wide hooped skirt. The French term for this were paniers because they sort of, which is the French word for basket. You basically strap these basket-like contraptions around your waist and wore the skirts over it. This woman has a high headdress, these very elaborate, some of them more elaborate than others, a French style of headdress, which in France was called a pouf, with a little lace cap on top of it, the hair stiffened with pomade and also powdered. The young woman sitting in the middle is wearing a kind of training version, a young person's version of this outfit, and also wearing a boned undergarment. And this, you may hear, and this is one of the myths I'll talk about, that women didn't wear corsets during the Regency era. And if you want to be a little snide about it, you could say, well, no, indeed, they did not wear corsets in this area. In this era, they wore stays. This is what how they were referred to, and I'll show you some examples in a little bit. But one of the things that drives people a little up the wall with period dramas, if you're a dress historian, is there's the obligatory scene of the young girl, a young woman being sort of tight-laced into a corset or stays for the first time, and she can't breathe and she passes out. This is usually not the way this worked. You were sort of from a very early age had sort of loose, lighter versions of this so that you could become accustomed to wearing it. So this is the beginning of Jane Austen's lifetime. By the end of her lifetime, you get something like this. This is a painting by Rolinda Sharples, which we'll see again. And you can see again, everything seems so much simpler. And I think one of the appeals of Regency dress for Regency romance novel readers, for people who love these period dramas, is that it's just elegant enough, it's just historical enough to be romantic, but still something that you could see yourself wearing. Men are wearing something like the ancestor of the modern suit. Women have these high-waisted dresses with relatively simpler hairstyles. Again, there's this kind of upsweep, but they're it's very elegant. It's very just luxurious enough, but it's something relatable, more so than the fashions that we were just previously looking at, or the fashions that would follow later on in the 19th century with, say, the big crinoline hoop skirts, those rounder hoop skirts of the mid-19th century, and the bustles and all those kinds of things. It seems much simpler. That, to a certain extent, is nostalgia combined with a little bit of illusion, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I think this is one of the reasons for the appeal of Regency period dramas and Regency romances is, again, it's just the dress is just romantic enough, but still something people could imagine themselves wearing. And indeed, at a number of Jane Austen Society events and other events like it, you will see people wearing outfits like this. The Regency era has also attracted scholarship, serious scholarship over the years, and especially in recent years. And here are two books that I can recommend very highly that have been published just within the last few years. Hilary Davidson's Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, Regency Fashion, and on the left, Amelia Rauser's The Age of Undress. And I'll talk about what undress meant at the time, and we'll actually see this painting that's on the cover of the book in full. These are very wonderful complementary books because Hilary Davidson focuses much more on the British. She is more interested in the mechanics of how the clothes were made, about how the fabrics worked, and also about the larger social and economic implications of the trade in these goods and other things that went behind uh, to create Regency dress. Rausser is more interested, she's very interested in the social aspect of it, but she's also much more interested in the aesthetics of this much more radically simplified kind of fashion. So you can gain tremendous amount of insight from books like this. And this is scholars taking this era of dress very seriously and treating it as serious historical evidence. But of course, as often happens whenever there's a popular period drama, there's a certain amount of, I would say, wishful thinking by some people that it's going to spark an interest in period influence on contemporary fashion, and especially when it's Regency fashion, again, when it's something people can imagine themselves wearing. So here's an article from Marie Claire in 2021, which, announces that the Regency is back, baby, and thanks to Bridgerton, people are going to start dressing in Regency fashion. I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen. But it's this, again, it's the idea that people can imagine themselves in these clothes is a huge part of the appeal of the dress in these period dramas. Now, as I mentioned, I want to talk about using specific examples to lead to larger issues related to Regency dress, both in the historical period of the Regency itself, but also in terms of how we think of it subsequently, how it appears in period dramas like Bridgerton, and how we imagine it and reimagine it through nostalgia. So I'm going to talk about historical accuracy, and there's one specific aspect of Regency dress that I want to use that to address that. Myths of Regency clothing, for example, they didn't wear corsets, which is not technically true. They did wear stays. They just look different, and we'll see examples of that. The sense of ideals, we look to these elegant clothes and we think what a dream of grace and beauty they might be. But there's a certain amount of conflict between how they function, these clothes functioned in reality, and then to use that as a springboard to talk about nostalgia. Why are we so entranced by this historical dress, and is it accurate? Are we right to be entranced by this form of historical dress? So again, I'll be using examples in each of these cases. Now, as I mentioned, how we imagine what does Regency dress look like, and this was an era where there is an enormous amount of visual evidence that we have. Not only, it's among the earliest eras where we have actual surviving clothing from the period in any considerable numbers. There are earlier outfits and clothes that have survived, but we have lots of them that have survived. But we also have an enormous amount of visual evidence. The Regency era, broadly, 1790s onwards, is an era where you have fashion magazines that are being widely distributed to various economic levels, and you have these beautiful fashion plates that advertise the latest fashions. So something like the Gallery of Fashion, published by Nicholas Heideloff in the 1790s and early 1800s, and then the Repository of Arts, published by Rudolf Ackermann from 1809 to 1829, which is often referred to as Ackermann's Repository. And I put these two up so that you can see that, again, thinking back to Jane Austen and her novels, on the left, these fashions of the mid-1790s with more hair still being powdered, high waist, but fuller dresses, layers of petticoats, a much sort of slightly fussier look. This is how women were dressing when Jane Austen began the novels that would become Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey. On the right, from Ackermann's Repository from 1812, you have a fashion in that sleek line, close-fitting line of the 18 teens, which is when you have Austen era period dramas, and Austen adaptations, this is usually what women are shown wearing. And Bridgerton is supposed to be set in 1813, at least the first season was. And so you get a sense of it. It's exactly that moment. It also is indication that there really is no excuse, frankly, for costume designers not to be historically accurate when you have the kind of wealth of visual information that we have. Nevertheless, sometimes they really, really get it right. This is a still from Autumn de Wilde's 2020 version of Jane Austen's Emma, with Anya Taylor-Joy as Emma wearing a dress which is a pretty much an exact replica of this dress from about 1810, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And it's basically the same dress. So you can, again, there's so much surviving visual evidence. We know what it looked like. You can be extremely accurate if you want to be. But historical accuracy, has its limits and its, has its various aspects. I'm not going, as I said, I'm not going to go into a history of Regency fashion, and I'm not going to do a blow by blow look at every costume and decide if it's historically accurate. There's an enormous number of videos on YouTube that you can watch. This is just 4 of them that I'm showing you, but there are many others you could watch. Clockwise from top left, Karolina Żebrowska, Zach Pinsent, Abby Cox, and Mina Lay. But you just get into YouTube, type into the search box, Bridgerton costume reviews, and you could spend many merry hours watching these brilliant, knowledgeable, and very delightful people talk about the historical accuracy of these clothes from various angles. The one sliver of it that I want to talk about, which shows you the kind of limits and possibilities of historical accuracy, is with court dress, what you wore to go to court. You could say, if I'm being honest, I would say that my issues with Bridgerton started in the first few minutes of the first episode of the first season, when Daphne Bridgerton and the other young ladies are presented to Queen Charlotte at court. First of all, aside from the fact that court presentation was not like your college graduation, where your entire family could, including your younger siblings, could watch you go through this. The whole point is that you're being inducted into this elite exclusive world of the court. But there are also some issues with the accuracy of the costuming. You see the young ladies on the left with their feathers. I'll get back to the ostrich feathers, the plumes in just a little bit. Not only the young ladies being presented, but in 1813, when Bridgerton takes place, and before and after, all the women present would have been wearing these feathers on their heads. The other thing is that the costuming, the court dresses, are really inaccurate for the British court in 1813, because this is a print from another publication of Rudolf Ackermann's The Microcosm of London. This is from 1809, which shows a drawing room, which was the name not just for a room, but for the actual event where people were presented at court and sort of hung around, meeting the royals at the court of St. James. And this shows the women, as you can see, where they're all wearing feathers, and they're wearing these hooped skirts, which are extremely unfashionable for this time. The fact is that until the death of Queen Charlotte in 1818, and then 1820, when George III died and George IV became king, these hoops were still worn by ladies at court, much to their kind of general chagrin. And this is a fashion that the pannier skirts, these hoop skirts, they're not shaped like 19th century crinolines. They're wide, they could get very wide, as you can see here from this French plate from the 1770s. These skirts were so wide that women would, as this woman has to do here, you'd have to go through the door sideways to get in. But they started earlier, but they reached their greatest width. And they're not round like the later crinoline skirts, they're flat, but you can see that it's very wide. And this is the widest they got, was in the late 1770s, as did the tall headdresses, the hairstyles, with these ostrich plumes on top. This was all part of a truly fashionably dressed lady. What happened was that the hoops, as well as the feathers, were worn by ladies going to the British court, as I said, until 1818 to 1820. This is a plate from 1817, which shows a court dress with the new hoop. They tried to make a slightly smaller hoop in order to, because women were sort of grumbling about still having to wear these hoops, even though the rest of their lives, they're wearing these kind of slimmer lined high-waisted dresses. And this provoked a lot of commentary all throughout the early 19th century. Just to give you a couple of examples, one is a quotation from one of Jane Austen's favorite novels, Belinda by Maria Edgeworth, which was published in 1801. The worldly Lady Delacour ridicules the hoop awkwardness, as she puts it, of other ladies. She says, "There's my friend Lady C. In an elegant undress," again, I'll explain undress in a little bit. "In an elegant undress, she passes for very genteel, but put her into a hoop and she looks as pitiable a figure, as much a prisoner, and as little able to walk as a child in a go-kart." Even pithier was a comment from the Franco-American artist, merchant, art dealer, and writer, Louis Simon, who was in Britain in 1810, 1811, and attended events at court. Simon described the fully dressed court lady in these hooped skirts with the high waists, fashionable high waist, as he said they resembled the fetus of a hippopotamus in a brandy bottle, end quote. Now, it wasn't until, as I said, after the death of George III and the accession of George IV, that women going to the British court were able to wear court dresses with trains, but dresses that looked more like the fashionable line of the moment, with the high waist and the relatively slimmer skirt. And so are these Bridgerton court costumes, are they historically accurate? Are they what women going to the British court in 1813 would have worn? No. Are they what women who went to the British court in 1813 wish they could have worn? Almost certainly yes. So this is one of those cases, it's one of those gray areas where you could be historically accurate, but it's okay to sort of push the fantasy. And I know everybody says, oh, Bridgerton is just a fantasy, stop being so fussy about it. But this is a case where I could see you can sort of ignore the historical accuracy for the sake of just making it more quote unquote attractive in a way that women in 1813 would have preferred if they'd had a choice. But as I said, all of the ladies at court would have worn these ostrich plumes in the hair. And it's one of the other kind of myths about it, about these ostrich feathers. Of course, they were very expensive because they were imported in large numbers from ostriches in Africa. So there were these crates of these feathers that would come over. They were very expensive, and also show both sort of mercantilism and burgeoning colonialism, of course, as imperialism, as they're bringing these products from outside of Europe. But they're often said to be, people sometimes say, oh, they're an homage to the badge of the Prince of Wales. This is the Prince of Wales kind of emblem. You can see on the right with these 3 white feathers, a crown, and the German motto, Ich dien, I serve, because it was stolen from a German prince in the 14th century. That's another story. But I think the costume designers in Bridgerton are trying to approximate that look. That's actually not true. This is a kind of story that people tell in order to make it sound more official. The feathers were really what those are, because you can see here, these women, they're not wearing 3 feathers looking like the Prince of Wales badge. There are as many feathers as you can stick on your head at one time and pin into your hair and arrange them in as artistically elegant a way as you want to. These are the feathers that were fashionable in the 1770s. And what's happened is a phenomenon that dress historians call fossilization, where something that was once fashionable has become sort of frozen in time, and it is now part of some sort of official outfit, some official costume. And so it connotes history and tradition rather than novelty and change. The feathers stuck around in different forms for a very long time. Those of you who remember Downton Abbey, and I have seen Downton Abbey more than once, when Lady Rose was presented, here is Lady Rose and Lady Grantham wearing feathers. Now, these are the white feathers. These are the small, discreet, less is more 1920s versions of this. But ultimately, these feathers go back to the fashionable plumes of the 1770s, and they become fossilized. And in fact, they were worn by ladies going to the British court all the way until 1939. Now, I kept referring to undress, to Amelia Rousers, The Age of Undress. Lady Delacour in Belinda makes reference to an elegant undress. Undress was the opposite of court dress. Court dress is full, formal, grand, opulent, extremely elaborate. This is at-home dress, this is day dress, this is relaxing dress. And of course, the Regency period and its French and continental European contemporaries, this is about informality. And this is, of course, again, one of the great appeals of fashion of this era, is it looks very elegant, but it looks very simple and something you can wear. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these images, but I want to put up these two as examples of undress. But they have certain things in common. We have a French woman, we have an English woman painted in India on the right. And these white fabrics, especially this magical fabric muslin, which is a kind of cotton material that was very light, could be very sheer, could be very diaphanous, which is so characteristic of the era and so often usually in white for a variety of reasons. Among other things, it looked, they thought, like classical sculpture, classical Greek or Roman drapery. Yes, ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, as I'm sure a lot of you know, were painted in ancient times, often in very bright and very eye-catching colors, but those colors had faded with time, and the idea that the purity of these marble sculptures with their pure white marble was somehow associated with the noble purity of the ancient Greeks and Romans is a myth that developed at the time. But in any case, Jane Austen herself, there was something kind of slightly, let's say, risque about these very simple undress fashions. And so we have, for example, a letter that Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra in January 1801, and keep the date in mind that it's 1801 and thereabouts. She is writing that they went to visit the wife of a clergyman, a neighboring clergyman, and his wife. And Jane Austen says, quote, "Mrs. Powlett was at once expensively and nakedly dressed. We have had the satisfaction of estimating her lace and her muslin, and she said too little to afford us much other amusement," end quote. And now this idea of being expensively but nakedly dressed. Muslin, as I mentioned, was a material that could be very diaphanous, often very sheer and very relatively easy to see through. And there was a whole lot of issues about morality and how much you were exposing of yourself, and health issues, and this is something that has persisted in the mythology of these dresses up to the present day. The vogue for muslin and for plain white fabrics, they also wore dresses made of linen and lawn, which is another kind of cotton material, another kind of linen material. These are two examples in my home museum, formerly David's Home Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, where you have a 1790s style on the right, and then on the left, in the portrait of the writer Constance Piplet, French writer, painted in 1797, showing this very plain, simple. She's not even trying to disguise the drawstring of the dress with a ribbon or something to sort of pretty it up. You see, though, on the left, just how radically simplified and how revealing the garments were for, at least for daring French women in the aftermath of the French Revolution. You can see the shape of her legs underneath that dress. You can see the bare arms and the bare elbows, which is the 18th century thought that the ugliest parts of a woman's body were the shoulders and the elbows. So whatever else is revealed, those things were always covered. But it's very, very plain. You can just make out everything. And these were considered daring even in France, let alone elsewhere. But they were also considered dangerous because they were considered to be so flimsy that they could lead to health issues, as we will see. Now, again, it's not true that they didn't wear corsets. They did, or they wore stays, these sort of previous forms of the corset. It's just that they change. Now, full disclosure, I have never worn a corset or stays. So I can't really attest to this. I know lots of women who have, and I know, and some men who have, and they really were not designed to be instruments of torture. You know, basically, you see the shift from a pair of stays on the left from the 1780s, so to create that kind of more solid shape, but to get you the narrower waist. And then in the late 1790s and early 1800s, something that is basically more like a brassiere, that is meant to sort of lift and support the breasts, but it's not supposed to be so tight that you can't breathe or can't move in it. They're really sort of practical undergarments. One other thing that period dramas often get wrong, sometimes deliberately, and that costume historians, dress historians will talk about, is you never wore stays or corsets against bare flesh. It was always over a usually sleeveless linen shift undergarment underneath. And it makes sense. These were hard to keep clean. They're often stiffened with whalebone and those kinds of materials. They didn't have dry cleaning in those days, so you wouldn't wear this against your bare skin. So when you see it worn against bare skin in a period drama, they're just trying to be sexy, sort of, Victoria's Secret about it. But the reality is it would have looked a lot sort of frumpier in reality. But you see something like this self-portrait by Constance Maillet, a French painter, and you see that, again, the bare arms, the bare elbows, the shape of the legs underneath. These white dresses, on the one hand, they were thought on the one hand to be kind of democratizing fashion because more people could afford this when you didn't have to wear all those layers and use all that fabric and use all that lace and other kinds of expensive materials. But on the other hand, these white muslin dresses were quite fragile. They could tear very easily. They got dirty very easily. They were washable, but still, there was something you had to be very, very careful with. But there were also concerns, precisely not just moral concerns, as I said, but also health concerns about how flimsy they were, especially when they got to Britain and the famous British climate, which were thought to be not very hospitable to this kind of dressing. So satirical cartoonists like James Gilray shows the graces in a high wind. These are these fashionably dressed ladies. The wind is blowing and the dresses are clinging to them in very deliberately suggestive ways, let's face it. But this is the mythology. Even in France, people, and certainly in Britain, people talked about muslin disease. You'd get pneumonia and you die from wearing these flimsy little outfits in all that wind. One of the persistent myths or rumors about these dresses is that women would dampen the dresses so that the fabrics would cling to them, sort of like a very classy version of a wet t-shirt contest. But in fact, we don't know if women did that or if that is just kind of an urban legend. this business about dampening the fabrics. But it's wearing these diaphanous materials then also led to the vogue for shawls and other kinds of coverings, things like the pelisse that we saw Jane Austen wearing in her portrait, or the spencer, which is a kind of short, long-sleeved jacket. But this vogue for shawls, as you can see here, these are Russian ladies, but I just love these shawls. Now, the best shawls were made in India and in the Asian subcontinent. In Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram's son Tom goes off to Antigua in the Caribbean, where the family estate is. Another story, but they and the Lady Bertram, who is kind of, for a variety of reasons, is kind of permanently out of it, keeps saying, "Oh, I hope Tom brings me back a shawl." And this is probably the usually befuddled Lady Bertram confusing the West Indies with the East Indies. But in any case, you see these kind of shawls probably from India, but they also made imitations, hence the name cashmere for this kind of wool material. But again, there's this discussion of, is this part of the neoclassicism, the Greek and Roman revival of the late 18th and early 19th centuries? And these outfits do in some ways bear a resemblance to ancient Greek and especially ancient Roman dress. This is a fragment of a fresco from Pompeii from ancient times, showing a woman, actually the goddess Venus with Cupid, wearing the classic outfit of a Roman woman, which would include garments which are called the tunica or tunic, which is a kind of undergarment, sleeveless undergarment. And then, confusingly for modern speakers of English, what was called a stola, which is not the wrap, that's not a stole. The stola referred to the sort of nicer overdress that you put on. And then the wrap that went around it was referred to as a palla. And so these shawls are often arranged in these paintings as if they're elegant ancient Roman pallas. We do know, of course, these women wore shawls as, as protective covering, as something like, they wrap them around themselves and they put them over their mouths to act as mufflers in cold weather. But in paintings, they all look very draped and, artistic. And that's one of the issues with the fashion of this era as well. You can't always tell if what someone, especially a woman, is wearing in a portrait, whether that is actual fashionable dress that she's wearing, or if it's something artistic and classical looking that the artist put on her for the purpose of coming up with a kind of timeless, beautiful, historical appearance. Speaking of Russian ladies, you can go right upstairs and visit her. I love my home museum, the Art Institute of Chicago. But one thing, we have a very nice collection, but one thing I wish we had is a portrait by Vigée Lebrun. So you're very fortunate in this museum to have this exquisite portrait of a Russian lady. And Ms. Ladomirsky here is wearing an outfit, though, that is, first of all, the way the hair is kind of down, which it wouldn't necessarily have been for formal dress. And then she's got sort of a, drapery, which is very sheer, and something like a palla, something or more like a stola, more kind of an overgarment. It's so far off the shoulder, this diaphanous fabric, and it's so flimsy and see-through. This would be an outfit that it would be controversial enough in post-revolutionary France, let alone if you were wearing it on the street, let alone in the ultra-conservative Russia of 1800 under the rule of the reactionary Tsar Paul. So my suspicion here is that Vigée Lebrun has put a beautiful artistic classical dress on her rather than as showing her as wearing something that she might wear it on the street. But again, the lines can get pretty blurred with this neoclassical dress as to whether you're looking at something fashionable that would actually be worn or something that is just used as classical dress for a painting. Another aspect of undress, again, there are various ways in which these people got around the issue of how to wear a slender, beautiful, clinging white dress with, of course, petticoats and things underneath, and usually stays, which I suspect this young lady is wearing, but also ways to protect yourself, especially during the day, where showing too much flesh would be considered really inappropriate, and also to protect yourself from the weather, etc. So this young woman is wearing not only kind of added longer sleeves, but she's also wearing this garment over this kind of, it was just kind of a simple garment, and you could have lots of these, which was referred to using in in the English speaking world, they use the French word chemisette, a little chemise, a little kind of a blouse, which could be very sheer of muslin, but which was, again, worn sort of protecting over your bosom, especially for day wear. As I mentioned, this is a young woman we know. This was painted in India, which is where the English artist Robert Home was working at this particular time. She has this exquisite painted Indian ivory box on the table. And this, though, brings up other issues, which is, as I said, sort of burgeoning empire, burgeoning colonialism, taking in more and more of the planet. And as the British are expanding power and wealth, and not just trade, but actual control over other parts of the world. This is very important to bring up. And I think that this is one thing that scholars, historians are talking about more and more, and they should, in my opinion, which is this connection of cotton, the cottons that made these muslins. They made muslin in India, they made muslin in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and they also made imitations of it in Europe. But a lot of the imported stuff was considered to be the finest and the best quality. But there is the reality that cotton was part of this kind of triangular trade involving cotton, sugar, and enslaved people going all over around the globe. And as much as I'm as guilty as anybody of reading Jane Austen as escapist, sort of comfort food, as much as you can enjoy the delightful fantasy of Bridgerton, as long as we all acknowledge that these are fantasies, or that these are carefully selected views of the world. So you have, for example, there was the Italian-born artist Agostino Brunias, who worked in England, and then the British government sent him over to the Caribbean to do paintings of life there. And so you will see a variety of people, both European people of European descent living there, of sort of mixed race people, people of color, free people of color, as well as enslaved people. Although in Brunias's work, you almost never see enslaved people actually working, actually picking cotton or making these fabrics. But you nevertheless see this range of people, and you can see the universality of wearing these white garments, which could be sometimes linen. They did have a kind of linen, which was also exported, but these white muslins, which were worn and went to Britain and all over the world. This is another Brunias showing free women of color, two sisters with their mother here, excuse me, and their children and servants. Presumably some of the servants are really not servants, but enslaved people. But you have this reality that behind these lovely, magical, diaphanous, flowing fabrics was this kind of brutal, ugly reality. Jane Austen, like most of her family, was opposed to the slave trade. They were, abolitionists who did not like slavery. And there are occasional and very, let's say, at best, uncomplimentary references to the slave trade in Austen's novels. But nevertheless, this is the kind of reality behind this. And I don't like people just dismissing this as, or you're just being politically correct or whatever. This is the reality behind the lovely fantasy, the charming fantasy of Regency dress. Now, people have often compared men's fashions to women's fashions at this same time. And the fact that, like women wearing these more form-fitting dresses, men are similarly wearing more precisely tailored clothes that show off more the shape of their bodies and can also highlight it up to a certain point. And supposedly the significant figure there is George Bryan Brummel, who we know as Beau Brummel, who supposedly is the man who led the charge for simplifying male dress beginning in the late 1790s. The reality is Brummel had antecedents and he had some contemporaries, but he is the person who probably popularized this kind of crisp tailoring more so than ever before. This is what people usually say is a caricature, and I can see why, of Brummel. He looks a little supercilious here, but you can see that he's wearing buckskin breeches, which, that show off the legs quite nicely, as do these boots, a very carefully tailored jacket, and this high collar, which would be boned with whalebone like a lady's corset or stays. And the other thing that links men's clothing to women's fashions of the time is that the cravats or neckties were also often made of muslin, that same material, and bleached muslin, hand washed, and so on. And there's, in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, there's a famous discussion of muslin where the hero, Henry Tilney, unusual for a Jane Austen hero, usually they're not that interested in womanly things, quote unquote, like fashion. But Henry Tilney knows his muslins because he helps his sister buy dresses. And he also uses some of the leftover fabric to make his cravats made with it. So there's all of this, and this is typical of Brummel. You tie the cravat very high with this high collar so that you can't help but sort of look down on the rest of the world and give people a fashion score as you're sort of looking them over. This is all part of this kind of Brummel mystique. Again, this is the sort of ancestor of modern men's London Bond Street tailoring, that sort of bespoke tailoring that is, everything is sort of beautifully fitted to your form specifically, and also the limited palette, the more understated range of colors. Men are no longer being able to get away with wearing pink and bright blue and these kinds of things. It's, dark blue, buff colored, gray, brown, and black eventually, and white as the only colors suitable to men's clothing. Nevertheless, again, we can look back and say, Beau Brummel, the epitome of understated elegance. But the Brummel-influenced dandies were also caricatured, as in this print by George Cruikshank, which is called Hummingbirds or a Dandy Trio, in which the languidness, the teased hair, the too tight trousers, the narcissism of gazing in the mirror, all of this, there are all kinds of references in the music books and the pictures that on the walls that I don't have time to go into, but all of this is very exaggerated in this kind of over the top sort of way. And again, we may look back nostalgically on the Regency as an era of understated elegance, but then, as in any other time, there were people who criticized the fashions as being ridiculous or immoral or overly over the top, or for men, quote unquote, effeminate, to use that old-fashioned term. And there were people just criticizing it even then. This is another constant in the history of dress, is whatever people are wearing, there are always people who are unhappy with it. It's these kids today, what they're wearing, it's ridiculous and not like the nice clothes we wore. And, this is the funny thing about nostalgia, as I always like to say, it must be true that things were better in the old days because people have been saying that for thousands of years. Now, this leads me to this issue too, that speaking of exaggeration and speaking of lack of simplicity, when you get to the actual 18 teens, to the quote unquote Regency proper, those slim-lined, unadorned, very clingy dresses of the very late 1790s and early 1800s, that era when in 1801, Jane Austen could describe Mrs. Powlett as nakedly dressed. That really has gone by the wayside. And by the time you get to the teens, fashion has become more elaborate, more historical influences start to come in. So for example, again, this is French influence, but was very influential in Britain. Somebody like Empress Josephine, the first wife of Emperor Napoleon, adopting this kind of a spiky collar, like a ruff that go back to the ruffs of the early 17th century, or with Josephine's daughter, Hortense de Beauharnais, who married one of Napoleon's brothers, and he made them King and Queen of Holland. She's wearing the puffed up sleeves and the kind of tightened sleeves and the ruff around the neck that go back to the 16th century. You start to find Renaissance influences, 17th century influences, medieval influences, all kinds of influences coming into the fashions by the time you get to the 18 teens. So when we come back to Rolinda Sharple's painting, you can see those supposedly simple clothes aren't really all that simple anymore. You've got men wearing a sort of Brummel-esque look, but with more sort of exaggerated collars, the stark black and white contrast, which actually Brummel didn't like too much. He said it made men look like magpies, the little black birds with the white tuft at the neck. And women wearing these puffed sleeves and waistlines of all different types, and all kinds of flounces and flowers and ruffles and all kinds of things all over the dresses. You have this wearing of sheer muslin over silk or satin. At the time, they were referred to as slips, which is basically to say, in this case, underdresses, underskirts, with more elaborate hairstyles creeping in. We're no longer in the era of absolute simplicity. It's just getting fussy enough. And again, these satirical cartoonists were well aware of how over the top and ridiculous everything was getting all over again. They didn't like it when the clothes were too simple, because that's, slightly obscene and risque, but they didn't like it when things started to get elaborate again either. And this is Cruikshank's Dandies or Monstrosities of 1818. And it makes me think of this because, getting back to Bridgerton, you take, for example, the Featheringtons with their outrageously over-the-top outfits, the silhouettes, the way the body is draped, et cetera, are a little all over the place. The fabrics, the colors, and the decorations are completely historically inaccurate for the Regency. And I'm not criticizing, that's deliberate. They did this on purpose. And they wanted the Featheringtons to look as vulgar and as trashy as possible, as opposed to the elegantly tasteful Bridgerton family. But as we've seen, the satirical cartoonists got their way ahead of them. And in a way, you could be exaggerated and give the Featheringtons a vulgar look without having to go quite this far. You could maybe take your inspiration from the satirical cartoonists somewhere between the elegant ideals of the fashion plates and the outrageous ridiculousness of the satirical cartoonists. Somewhere in between, there's reality and the slight comical exaggeration of reality where you could make that work. So I think Jane Austen understands that. Rolinda Sharples understood it. There's just enough social commentary and social satire in this painting as there is in Jane Austen novels, but there's also sort of higher ideals of wanting to achieve a kind of gracious classical appearance. So Regency dress, like the Regency itself, like any historical era, is an extremely complex time in terms of what people are wearing, where fashion has been, where it's going. And again, the historical accuracy for period dramas, I used to be the most intolerant person of historical inaccuracies in dress. Still bugs me when they don't even bother, they don't even try. But, you do have to cut people a little bit of slack. You're not only recreating an era, you're also telling stories and creating characters, and all of those things have to factor in. So to conclude, I'm just going to one more image, one more slide, which on the right shows Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy in the Pride and Prejudice 1995 in the famous Speaking of Clingy Wet Shirts here in The Shirt. And on the left is William Phillips, who is here, and myself posing with The Shirt, worn by Colin Firth. This was on display at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. in 2016 for the Jane Austen Society annual general meeting that year. So we took the liberty of posing with the shirt. And when they installed it, apparently all the young women who worked at the Folger were able to watch them install the shirt, and there are photographs of young women literally prostrating themselves in front of the shirt. It just shows you just how fetishistic people can get about items of clothing if they have certain kinds of historical or heartthrobby associations. So again, I thank you very much for having me out today. I hope the talk was enlightening and interesting, and that the next time you pick up a Jane Austen novel or watch a period drama, Bridgerton or otherwise, that it will make you think of some of these things and give you a little bit of a visualization as you're doing the reading and give you a little bit of the context. So thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Do we have time for questions, you think? Okay. Are there any questions online? Are there questions? If there are questions online, or if anybody has a question, you have to, I can't really see. Well, yes.
Anybody? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, he's there. David's got a microphone, so I don't have to repeat the questions.
Of course, I didn't know this, but in the second season of Bridgerton, when you just talked about this shirt, and I forget the name of the brother who's like the heartthrob of the daughter, and he's marrying the wrong sister and that whole thing. But he actually goes in the lake and comes out of the water with this tight white shirt, which I just think is interesting. And I'm just wondering if the lady that wrote the series had that image of Mr. Darcy in mind, because the hot brother, and I'm sure people know who I'm talking about.
Couldn't say for certain, obviously. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is to say yes.
Yeah.
Because this moment of Darcy, and here's the funny thing about Darcy in the shirt.
Yeah.
You never actually, he jumps into the pond. This is the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. He jumps into the pond.
Okay.
You never see him come out of the water.
Okay.
You see him jump into the pond. You see him swim. Oh, it actually was a stunt double, but you see him jump into the pond, and then he comes out. You don't see him come out, rather. The next time we see him, he's sauntering across the lawn in this wet, clingy shirt. But everybody thinks they saw Mr. Darcy come out of the water. Yeah. And there was another wonderful series a few years back called Lost in Austen. I don't know if anybody saw that, where a young woman goes through a portal in her bathroom and ends up in Pride and Prejudice as a modern woman. And she, at one point, long story, but she does get emotionally involved with Mr. Darcy. And she says to him, "Would you do something for me?" And the next shot, you see him rise out of the water wearing this clingy shirt. And she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of a postmodern moment here."
Yeah.
And everybody thinks you saw Darcy come out of the water like, male Venus rising from the sea. But you actually don't see it. But it shows you just how deeply ingrained in the imagination that moment is. Now, the shirts wouldn't have been quite that tight, actually. They were very loose for men. And in fact, your shirt was, they were also very long because they didn't wear underpants. So you tucked your shirt underneath to function in that similar way between you and your breeches. But yeah, I'm sure, I don't know, but my guess is that's an homage to that famous moment. Yeah.
Oh, I see some other questions. I'll get back with the microphone.
Yeah, sorry, David's.
No, I'm glad
our
that there are
poor David
questions.
is having a little trouble walking these days, so you
true.
have to be
some muscle strain.
Sympathetic.
Hi.
Hi.
In Sir Thomas Lawrence illustrations of King George IV and earlier the Prince Regent, you know, it's shown with his hair just so perfect, right?
Mhm.
You know, teased, and it's very, you know, this is a guy who was very overweight, and but he looks very good in it. Was he imitating the fashion of younger people, or were younger people then imitating his fashion? Who set the standard during that period?
Who set the standard? It's a very good question because, yes, Sir Thomas Lawrence always makes the Prince Regent / George IV look more athletic, let's say, than he was in reality. But this is, for a while, Beau Brummel and the Prince Regent were really good friends. And everybody Brummel was supposedly the guy who set the tone, set the standard. When Brummel got dressed in the morning, he had this very little house, and people would stand on the stairs and they'd go and watch him get dressed so they could see how he tied the cravats and all this kind of thing. That sort of perfectly done but windblown looking hair. It's very hard to tell who came up with that at first. It's possible that it either was in imitation of or what everybody thought was the look of Lord Byron. It's a sort of dramatically windblown look. But you're right, it was usually very carefully done. And the Prince Regent, I think, also used to wear wigs. He used to wear sort of toupees. And so it always looks, you know, very dramatically windblown, but that would have been very carefully styled to look that way. So it's an interesting time because Brummel sets the fashion until about 1816 when his debts caught up with him. And then he started saying disparaging things about the Prince Regent. And Brummel ends up in France in exile, where unfortunately he eventually suffered the effects of mental illness as well as poverty, which his biographer, Ian Kelly, has determined his mental illness, Brummel's mental illness had its roots in syphilis. And that was the reason for it. But you find somebody, Brummel liked to pretend he was Mr. Nobody from nowhere. He was actually from a pretty well-connected family. But the idea of this guy setting the standard of what's good style and what's good fashion for everybody is an unusual thing. But the Prince Regent, I think, liked to see himself as a fashion trendsetter. And in his younger days, especially about the later 1780s, certainly 1790s, he was more of a trendsetter, but eventually he started sort of following the fashion rather than leading it. But yeah, the question of influence is always very fascinating because people like to see the one person as the person. So you have somebody to blame if you don't like the way things look. You can say, well, it's all that person's fault because they started that stupid style in the first place. But I don't know that, I think it's a very complex phenomenon about who influences whom and in what ways. So it's a very good question. There was another.
I think one last or a couple more questions.
Maybe one or two more.
I'm going to shift gears maybe a little bit. I don't know. I'm not an English major, but I love to read. And I always get Emily Bronte confused with Jane Austen.
Heaven forbid. Oh
I know,
my God.
heaven forbid. But I'm always like, okay, who wrote Jane Eyre? But where does Emily Bronte fall in? Is she a peer of Jane Austen's? Was she during this period?
Well, the Bronte sisters are generally a little bit later. I mean, their heyday was, as they were writing, was the 1820s and 30s. Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, most famously. Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre and other novels, and their sister Anne wrote novels as well. They're a little bit later. They're very different. In fact, what people say, you know, I say heaven forbid, because the Charlotte Bronte made some very disparaging remarks about Jane Austen in her letters. So the Jane Austen fans are generally not big fans of Charlotte Bronte. But the Brontes are a little bit later, and so their fashion would have been very different. Their style was very different. Charlotte Bronte didn't like Jane Austen because she thought it was too narrowly confined in terms of social class, in terms of the emotions are so, and it's really not true. There's a lot of emotion in Austen, but it's not a romantic, heart on your sleeve, running around the moors, you know, kind of thing. And in fact, when you in a Jane Austen novel like Marianne and Sense and Sensibility, when you run around the rainy moors, you end up, you know, getting sick and almost dying. So let that be a lesson to you. But it's a very different kind of feeling. The Brontes are much more about, you know, passion and all of that. But like Jane Austen, they were daughters of a clergyman, and they lived in a sort of provincial life. But they're slightly later, and they're much more in the kind of romantic era
They
than Austen.
would be Victorian too, wouldn't
Yeah,
they?
they get into the Victorian era as well. So yeah, they're it's, and a lot of people think Austen's a Victorian because, you know, you're not supposed to have sex before marriage and all of that, but that was the social system even before Queen Victoria got to the throne. So yeah, but the Brontes are a little later. Yeah, I saw
One last question.
one last question.
I have a question about women's caps and bonnets,
Mm-hmm.
especially with a religious association. We have a woman in my family in 1820 with a painting with a bonnet, modest. And then a photograph of her out of England, but in America in the 1850s as an older woman, also with a similar bonnet. And so I'm wondering, wasn't that very predominant, a religiously associated modest headdress for most educated, prosperous women? And are the paintings and the fashion plates a little fashionable and aristocratic?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know if there were still religious foundations for wearing headdresses by the Regency era. It's more a question of fashion and practicality. You know, bonnets are meant to keep the sun off you, you know, to keep you from getting sunburned. But there were those sort of poke bonnets, those kind of bonnets shaped like that with the ribbons underneath. It's like a straw hat that's been pulled in and tied. Those are just one option among many that fashionable women had during the Regency era. They wore turbans, they wore various kinds of berets, they wore different kinds of headdresses for day wear and for being out and about. But I don't know that there's necessarily a religious association. It is true that a young woman with hair, a very young woman could go around maybe with her hair down, but usually once you got to be about a teenager, you were supposed to start putting your hair up. One of the things about some period dramas that's, again, a little bit frustrating is their hair is always down. Again, it looks great as you're running around in the wind, but it's really kind of historically inaccurate and would have been considered kind of morally inappropriate to have your hair down like that. But you can see in the fashion plates a whole range of headdresses and you know, bonnets and various kinds of things based on what you needed them for, what time of day it was, how much money you had to spend, how fashionable you wanted to be, etc. So yeah, it's a whole range. So okay,
Well, thanks everybody, and have a pleasant afternoon and evening.
thank
Bye-bye.
you very much. Thank you.